Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a journey back to a time when Earth was literally trying to kill everything on it. We're diving into the Mycenaean period, 5.5 million years ago, when our planet was a volcanic nightmare and survival meant adapting to conditions so extreme they would make Mars look hospitable. You might think you know what a hostile environment looks like, but trust me, you've never seen anything like this. If you're enjoying these deep dives into Earth's violent past, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it lets me keep bringing you these incredible stories from our planet's history. I'm always curious where you all are tuning in from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community connect through these ancient tales. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's travel back to an Earth so alien, it might as well be another planet entirely. We're going to explore what it took to survive when the ground beneath your feet could literally explode at any moment. Congratulations, you've just awakened in the Mediterranean basin 5.5 million years ago, during what scientists call the Mycenaean salinity crisis. The good news is you're alive and breathing. The bad news is the air you're breathing is thick with volcanic ash, sulfur compounds, and enough toxic gases to make your lungs burn with every breath. This isn't the Earth you know. This is a planet in the throes of geological violence on a scale that modern humans have never witnessed. The first thing that hits you isn't the heat, though it's sweltering. It's the sound. A constant, low rumble emanates from the Earth itself, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting rock and the distant roar of erupting volcanoes. The Mediterranean Sea, that pristine blue body of water you might remember, doesn't exist. In its place stretches a massive salt desert, blindingly white, under a sun filtered through perpetual ash clouds. The seafloor lies exposed, revealing a landscape of salt domes, dried riverbeds, and scattered pools of hypersaline water so concentrated they would burn your skin on contact. Standing on what was once the ocean floor, you can see the scars of catastrophic evaporation everywhere. Towers of salt rise like twisted monuments to a dying sea, some reaching hundreds of feet into the hazy sky. These aren't gentle formations. They're the crystallized remains of an ocean that vanished in geological terms overnight, leaving behind a toxic wasteland, where temperatures regularly soar above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. But the salt desert is just the beginning of your problems. All around the Mediterranean basin, volcanoes are awakening. Mount Vesuvius is a mere baby compared to the geological titans rumbling to life across southern Italy, Spain, and North Africa. These aren't isolated eruptions. They're part of a coordinated assault by the planet itself, triggered by massive tectonic shifts, as Africa continues its relentless collision with Europe. The Strait of Gibraltar has closed, cutting off the Mediterranean from the Atlantic Ocean. Without that constant inflow of water, the sea has begun to evaporate at a catastrophic rate. But this isn't just about losing a body of water. The disappearance of the Mediterranean is reshaping the entire regional climate, turning what was once a moderate coastal environment into something resembling the surface of Venus. Your skin immediately begins to crack in the dry heat. There's virtually no humidity in the air because there's no large body of water to provide it. The salt crystals in the air sting your eyes and nose with every breath. This isn't like walking on a beach where salt spray feels refreshing. This is like breathing in powdered glass mixed with industrial chemicals. The temperature isn't just hot, it's lethally hot. During the day, surface temperatures in the salt desert routinely exceed what modern humans consider survivable. The salt itself becomes burning hot to the touch, creating a landscape where finding shade isn't just comfortable, it's absolutely essential for survival. And shade is incredibly hard to come by in a world where most vegetation has either died off or retreated to the few remaining water sources. Speaking of water, forget everything you know about finding fresh water in a Mediterranean climate. The rivers that once flowed into the sea have either dried up entirely or become concentrated streams of brine more toxic than seawater. The few freshwater sources that remain are jealously guarded by whatever life has managed to survive this apocalyptic transformation. But perhaps the most disorienting aspect of this world is the constant volcanic activity. This isn't the occasional eruption that makes headlines in our modern world. This is sustained region-wide volcanism that fills the sky with ash and the air with sulfur. During the day, the sun appears as a dim, reddish disk through the haze. At night, the horizon glows orange and red from multiple eruptions, happening simultaneously across hundreds of miles. The volcanic ash isn't just an inconvenience. It's a deadly hazard that coats everything in a fine, abrasive powder that gets into your lungs, your food, your water, and your shelter. Breathing becomes labored within hours of exposure. Your throat burns constantly from the combination of sulfur dioxide and microscopic glass particles suspended in the air. And then there are the earthquakes. The same tectonic forces that closed the Gibraltar Strait and triggered the volcanic eruptions are also causing the ground to shake regularly. Not gentle tremors, but violent jolts that can topple rocky outcroppings and trigger landslides. In a landscape already made treacherous by extreme heat and toxic air, the constant threat of the earth literally moving beneath your feet adds another layer of mortal danger. The wildlife that does exist in this hellscape has been pushed to its absolute limits. The large mammals that once roamed the Mediterranean region are either extinct or have retreated to tiny refuges around the few remaining freshwater sources. These oases are overcrowded, fiercely contested territories where competition for resources can turn deadly in an instant. You might expect to find some relief by climbing to higher elevations, but the mountains present their own unique dangers. The volcanic activity has made many peaks unstable, prone to sudden collapses or explosive eruptions. The higher you go, the thinner the already compromised air becomes, and the more exposed you are to the constant rain of volcanic debris falling from the ash-laden sky. Food is virtually non-existent in the traditional sense. The plant life that survived the initial catastrophe consists mainly of hardy shrubs and grasses that have adapted to extreme salinity and heat. These plants are often toxic to mammals, evolved to concentrate salt and other minerals to levels that would poison anything trying to eat them. Hunting is nearly impossible because most animals have either died off or learned to be extremely elusive in their desperate fight for survival. The psychological impact of this environment cannot be overstated. Imagine living under a sky that never clears, where the sun is always filtered through volcanic haze, where the air always tastes of sulfur and salt. There's no escape from the constant stress of wondering when the next earthquake will hit, when the next volcanic eruption will send deadly pyroclastic flows racing across the landscape, or when the water source you found will finally dry up completely. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. The ground is either scorching hot salt that burns exposed skin, or sharp volcanic rock that cuts through anything you try to use as bedding. The air temperature at night might drop slightly, but it's still hot enough to cause severe dehydration. And the constant rumbling and occasional violent shaking make rest a luxury you simply can't afford. Navigation in this world is a nightmare. The familiar landmarks that might have existed before the crisis are either buried under salt deposits, destroyed by volcanic activity, or rendered unrecognizable by the dramatic changes to the landscape. The salt desert stretches to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional volcanic cone or collapsed section of what was once the seafloor. The few areas that might offer temporary refuge are incredibly dangerous to reach. River valleys that still contain some water are often filled with toxic gases that have settled in the low-lying areas. Caves that might provide shelter from the heat and ash are frequently unstable due to the constant seismic activity, and many serve as vents for volcanic gases that can kill within minutes. But here's what makes this period truly extraordinary from a survival perspective. Despite these seemingly impossible conditions, life did persist. Somehow, some species found ways to adapt, to survive, to even thrive in conditions that would kill most modern life forms within days. The key to understanding how anything survived this volcanic Earth lies not just in adaptation, but in finding the tiny pockets of relative safety that existed even in this hellscape. These refugees weren't comfortable by any standard, but they represented the difference between extinction and survival for countless species. Hidden springs that maintained lower temperatures due to underground flow patterns. Coastal areas where occasional Atlantic storms still brought brief respite from the heat. High-altitude caves that stayed cool enough to provide temporary shelter while still being accessible. The most successful survivors during this period were those who could remain mobile, moving constantly between these scattered safe zones as conditions changed. Staying in one place, no matter how temporarily comfortable, was a death sentence because the volcanic activity and extreme weather patterns could eliminate any refuge without warning. The most crucial survival skill in this volcanic wasteland wasn't strength or speed. It was the ability to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. The successful survivors learned to interpret the language of a dying landscape. They could tell by the color of volcanic smoke whether an eruption was imminent or waning. They understood that when the ground vibrations changed from a steady rumble to sharp rhythmic jolts, it was time to move immediately because a major quake was building. These environmental cues weren't optional knowledge. They were the difference between finding yourself caught in a pyroclastic flow or safely positioned on high ground when the mountain exploded. The texture of the salt deposits told stories about water sources. Smooth, crystalline formations indicated areas where water had evaporated recently, meaning there might still be underground reserves. Rough, jagged salt meant the area had been dry for extended periods, making it a death trap for anyone hoping to find hydration. Even more critical was learning to recognize the signs of toxic gas accumulations. Certain areas would be completely devoid of any plant life, not because of heat or salt, but because deadly volcanic gases had settled there. These invisible killers could drop you unconscious within minutes and kill you within the hour. The few surviving plants became your early warning system, their health and behavior indicating whether an area was safe to traverse. The animal survivors of this period developed some of the most extreme adaptations ever documented in the fossil record. Those that made it through weren't just tough, they were evolutionary marvels that pushed the boundaries of what mammalian life could endure. Some species developed the ability to process salt concentrations that would be lethal to modern animals. Others evolved specialized kidneys that could extract moisture from food sources with incredible efficiency, essentially living without drinking water for extended periods. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was behavioral. The surviving animals learned to work together in ways that their ancestors never had. Traditional predator-prey relationships broke down in favor of survival partnerships. Species that would normally compete began sharing information about food sources and safe zones because cooperation meant everyone had a better chance of making it through another day. These alliances weren't emotional or social in the way we might understand them. They were cold, calculated survival strategies born from the recognition that the environment had become so hostile that old evolutionary rules no longer applied. A fox might follow a bird not to hunt it, but because the bird's superior eyesight could spot toxic gas clouds or unstable ground that the fox would miss until it was too late. The few human ancestors that existed during this period underwent their own radical behavioral changes. Group sizes became smaller and more mobile. Traditional territorial behavior became impossible because no territory was stable enough to defend long term. Instead, survival groups developed complex migration patterns that followed seasonal changes in volcanic activity and the occasional weather patterns that might bring temporary relief. These proto-humans learned to cache supplies across vast distances, burying water and food in locations that might be accessible weeks or months later if they survived long enough to return. They developed tools specifically designed for this harsh environment, scrapers for removing salt buildup from skin, specialized containers that could hold water without contamination from volcanic ash, and weapons designed not for hunting large game, which barely existed, but for protection from the desperate animals competing for the same scarce resources. Communication became absolutely critical. Groups developed sophisticated signaling systems that could work across the perpetual haze and over the constant background noise of volcanic activity. These weren't just simple calls or gestures, but complex information transfer systems that could convey detailed information about distant conditions, resource availability, and immediate dangers. The daily rhythm of survival in this world followed patterns that would seem alien to modern humans. Dawn brought a brief window of cooler temperatures, but also increased volcanic activity as thermal currents began building with the rising sun. This was the time for movement, for covering ground while conditions were marginally more tolerable. Midday was for finding shelter and waiting out the peak heat and ash falls. Late afternoon might offer another brief window for movement if the wind patterns were favorable. Nights were spent in constant vigilance. While temperatures might drop slightly, the darkness brought new dangers. Toxic gases that had been dispersed by daytime thermal currents would settle into valleys and low areas. Volcanic activity often increased at night as temperature differentials triggered more eruptions. And the few remaining predators had adapted to hunt in darkness, using the cover of night to ambush anything near the scattered water sources. Water procurement became an all-consuming obsession. Every decision revolved around the next drink. The few freshwater sources that remained were often contaminated with volcanic minerals that could cause severe illness or death. Survivors learned to identify which minerals were merely unpleasant versus which were lethal. They developed primitive filtering techniques using layers of cloth and sand to remove the worst contaminants, though even filtered water was barely drinkable by modern standards. Food sources were equally challenging. The normal food web had completely collapsed. Traditional hunting and gathering were impossible because there simply wasn't enough life left to sustain those activities. Instead, survivors learned to exploit the few remaining resources with incredible efficiency. They learned which insects could survive the toxic environment and were safe to eat. They discovered that certain salt-tolerant plants, while barely palatable, could provide essential nutrients. Some groups learned to harvest volcanic minerals that contained trace nutrients essential for survival. This wasn't pleasant dining, it was consuming raw materials that kept basic biological functions operating. They learned to process salt deposits, to extract the small amounts of other minerals trapped within. They discovered ways to use GE, otherwise inedible plant matter, slightly more digestothermal heat, from volcanic vents to makeable. The social structures that developed during this period were unlike anything seen in more hospitable environments. Leadership wasn't based on strength or charisma, but on knowledge and decision-making ability. The individual who could best read environmental conditions and make accurate predictions about resource availability or dangers became invaluable to group survival. These leaders weren't dictators in any traditional sense. Their authority came from their ability to keep everyone alive another day. When their predictions proved wrong, or their judgment failed, leadership would shift immediately to whoever demonstrated better environmental awareness. This created highly fluid social hierarchies where status could change from hour to hour based on current conditions and immediate needs. Reproduction during this period became almost secondary to immediate survival, but it didn't stop entirely. The few offspring that were conceived faced incredible challenges from the moment of birth. Mothers had to maintain pregnancy while dealing with constant dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure to toxic environments. The infant mortality rate was catastrophic, with only the most robust babies surviving their first few weeks. Those children who did survive developed in ways that modern humans would find remarkable. They were exposed to environmental stresses from birth that created incredibly hardy individuals. Their lungs adapted to processing ash-laden air. Their kidneys became extraordinarily efficient at conserving water. Their skin developed resistance to salt and chemical burns that would be impossible for modern humans to develop. But survival came at a cost that went beyond the physical. The constant stress, the never-ending vigilance, the repeated loss of group members to the hostile environment created psychological pressures that shaped behavior in fundamental ways. Trust became both more precious and more fragile. Cooperation was essential, but betrayal over resources was always a possibility. The few cultural developments that occurred during this period were entirely focused on survival. Art, music, and storytelling were reduced to their most basic functions, passing along crucial information about environmental dangers and survival techniques. Every song was a mnemonic device for remembering which plants were safe to eat, or which cloud formations indicated incoming toxic ash. Every story contained life or death information disguised as entertainment, yet even in this hellscape, something remarkable was happening. The extreme pressures were driving evolution at an accelerated pace. The species that survived weren't just enduring, they were developing capabilities that would serve them well long after the volcanic crisis ended. The behavioral adaptations, the social cooperation, the tool use, and the environmental awareness being developed during this period would become the foundation for more complex societies once conditions eventually improved. The surviving populations were being forged in a crucible that eliminated every weakness and amplified every advantage. Those who lived through the Messinian crisis weren't just lucky, they were the products of the most intense natural selection pressure ever documented. They were becoming something new, something tougher, something better adapted to survival in extreme conditions than anything that had come before. The most haunting aspect of this volcanic Earth wasn't just the physical dangers, it was how the landscape itself seemed to conspire against life. The salt formations created optical illusions that could lead survivors miles off course, chasing mirages of water that existed only in the shimmering heat. The constant ashfall meant that landmarks changed daily, sometimes hourly. A rock formation that provided crucial shelter one morning might be buried under volcanic debris by evening, forcing constant adaptation and navigation skills that pushed cognitive abilities to their limits. But perhaps the most insidious danger was the way this environment attacked the mind as much as the body. The perpetual twilight created by ash clouds disrupted natural circadian rhythms. Sleep deprivation became chronic, not just from the physical discomfort, but because the brain couldn't properly regulate rest cycles without clear day-night distinctions. Hallucinations became common among survivors, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. The few groups that managed to maintain some semblance of organized society developed rituals and routines that served as psychological anchors in a world gone mad. These weren't religious ceremonies in any traditional sense, but practical activities that helped maintain mental stability. Counting steps while walking, reciting lists of safe plants, or performing repetitive tasks that required concentration became as essential for survival as finding food and water. Communication between scattered groups became an art form, born of desperation. Smoke signals were useless in an atmosphere already choked with volcanic emissions. Instead, survivors developed systems using reflective salt crystals to create flashing patterns visible across great distances during the brief moments when the sun broke through the ash clouds. These signals could convey complex information about resource locations, danger warnings, and group movements across the barren landscape. The most successful survivors learned to think like the volcanic landscape itself, predicting patterns in seemingly random destruction. They observed that certain types of volcanic activity followed predictable cycles. Small earthquakes often preceded larger ones by specific time intervals. Changes in the color and density of ash clouds could indicate whether an eruption was building to a climax or beginning to subside. This environmental literacy became the difference between stumbling blindly through a hellscape and moving with purpose through a dangerous but navigable world. Water became more than sustenance. It became currency, medicine, and hope rolled into one precious resource. The groups that survived longest were those who learned to extract moisture from seemingly impossible sources. They discovered that certain salt formations trapped small amounts of atmospheric humidity that could be harvested by covering salt domes with cloth during the cooler pre-dawn hours. They learned to dig for underground water sources by reading subtle changes in vegetation patterns and ground temperature variations. Even more remarkably, some survivors learned to predict rainfall by observing volcanic activity patterns. Certain types of eruptions created atmospheric conditions that would occasionally produce brief, intense storms. These rare weather events could provide enough water to sustain a group for weeks, but only if they were prepared to collect and store it efficiently during the few hours it lasted. The tool-making innovations of this period were driven by pure necessity. Traditional materials like wood were virtually non-existent, forcing survivors to work with volcanic glass, hardened salt deposits, and metal-rich volcanic rocks. They learned to shape obsidian-like volcanic glass into cutting tools sharper than anything available in more hospitable environments. Salt crystals were carved into containers and storage vessels that could withstand the extreme temperatures without cracking. These weren't crude implements hastily assembled for immediate use. The survivors who lasted longest were those who invested time in creating sophisticated toolkits designed for the specific challenges of volcanic survival. They developed specialized scrapers for removing salt buildup from skin and clothing. They created ventilation systems using hollow reeds and volcanic pumice to filter toxic gases from sleeping areas. They even learned to use geothermal heat from volcanic vents to work materials that would be impossible to shape at normal temperatures. The dietary adaptations required during this period pushed the boundaries of what mammalian digestive systems could handle. Survivors learned to process plants with such high salt concentrations that eating them would normally cause fatal dehydration. They developed techniques for leaching minerals from vegetation, essentially performing primitive chemistry to make toxic plants barely edible. Some groups learned to cultivate certain salt-tolerant microorganisms that could provide essential nutrients unavailable from any other source. Hunting, when possible at all, required completely different strategies than anything used before or since. The few animals that remained were incredibly wary and had developed their own extreme survival adaptations. They could detect the slightest vibrations in the ground, alerting them to approaching humans from impossible distances. They had learned to remain near toxic gas vents, where they were relatively safe from predators, but could quickly move to cleaner air when necessary. The most successful hunters learned to think like their prey, understanding that these animals weren't following normal behavioral patterns, but had developed entirely new survival strategies. Tracking became less about following footprints, and more about understanding the logic of survival in an impossible landscape. Where would an animal go to find the specific combination of safety, water, and food that it needed? How would it balance the risk of exposure against the need for resources? Shelter construction. During this period, evolved into an engineering discipline focused on protection from multiple simultaneous threats. Structures had to provide protection from extreme heat during the day and toxic gas accumulation at night. They needed to be stable enough to withstand frequent earthquakes, but portable enough to be abandoned quickly when volcanic activity shifted. Most importantly, they had to be built using materials that could withstand constant exposure to corrosive volcanic emissions without degrading into uselessness. The most ingenious shelters were built partially underground, using the Earth's natural insulation while avoiding the deepest levels where toxic gases accumulated. These semi-subterranean structures used volcanic rock for structural support and salt crystal panels for walls that could be quickly disassembled and rebuilt elsewhere. Ventilation systems used the natural convection created by geothermal heat sources to draw fresh air through living spaces while expelling contaminated air. But the true genius of these shelters lay in their integration with the volcanic landscape. Rather than fighting against the hostile environment, they worked with it. Geothermal vents were incorporated as heating sources during the cooler periods. Natural rock formations were used as foundations that could flex with seismic activity without collapsing. Even the constant ash fall was turned to advantage, with collection systems that gathered volcanic minerals useful for tool making and water purification. The social dynamics within survivor groups developed along lines that prioritized collective survival over individual advancement. Resource hoarding, which might make sense in less extreme environments, became counterproductive when the next volcanic eruption could eliminate any cache supplies instantly. Instead, successful groups developed sharing systems that distributed risks and resources across all members while maintaining individual accountability for group welfare. Leadership roles became highly specialized rather than hierarchical. One person might be the expert on reading volcanic activity patterns, another on identifying safe water sources, and a third on predicting weather changes that might provide brief windows for movement. These specialists weren't commanders in any traditional military sense, but rather essential resources whose knowledge kept everyone alive. When their particular expertise was most needed, they made critical decisions for the group. During other times, they deferred to whoever had the most relevant knowledge for current conditions. Conflict resolution within these groups had to be swift and practical. Extended disputes were luxuries that no one could afford when survival required constant cooperation and immediate decision-making. Groups developed rapid, consensus-building techniques that could resolve disagreements quickly while maintaining group cohesion. These weren't democratic processes in any modern sense, but practical systems for making life or death decisions when delay could mean extinction for everyone involved. The few children born during this period experienced childhood in ways that would be unrecognizable to modern humans. They learned to walk on burning salt flats before they learned to speak clearly. They could identify toxic gas concentrations by smell before they could count to 10. Their play activities were survival training exercises disguised as games, learning to move quietly across unstable volcanic debris, or to identify edible plants among the scattered vegetation. These children developed sensory abilities that would seem almost supernatural to people living in normal environments. They could detect subtle changes in ground vibrations that indicated approaching seismic activity. They could taste mineral concentrations in water that revealed contamination levels invisible to adults who hadn't grown up with such environmental pressures. Their hearing became so acute that they could distinguish between different types of volcanic activity based solely on the subtle variations in sound frequency and rhythm. Yet for all their remarkable adaptations, these children also carried the psychological burden of growing up in a world where death was always imminent and survival required constant vigilance. They learned to form attachments quickly, but also to let go easily when group members died or when circumstances required separation. They developed emotional resilience that allowed them to function effectively in crisis situations. But this came at the cost of the kind of carefree childhood development that occurs in more stable environments. The educational systems that developed during this period were unlike anything that existed before or after. Every lesson was literally a matter of life and death. Children learned geography by memorizing the locations of safe zones and dangerous areas. They learned chemistry by understanding which mineral combinations were toxic and which could be used for survival purposes. They learned physics by understanding how volcanic gases behaved in different atmospheric conditions and how seismic waves traveled through various types of ground. Mathematics became a survival tool focused on resource allocation and risk assessment. How much water could a group consume per day while still maintaining a safety reserve? How many days could they survive in a particular location before volcanic activity patterns suggested they needed to move? What were the statistical probabilities of finding resources versus encountering fatal dangers along different travel routes? These weren't abstract academic subjects. but immediately practical knowledge that determined whether individuals lived or died on a daily basis. The most successful educational approaches integrated multiple disciplines into single lessons that taught survival skills while building cognitive abilities. Learning to navigate by volcanic landmarks simultaneously taught geology, astronomy, mathematics, and practical survival techniques. Language itself evolved during this period to meet the demands of survival in an extreme environment. Vocabulary expanded rapidly in areas related to volcanic activity, toxic substances, and environmental dangers. Survivors developed precise terminology for describing different types of ash falls, various grades of water contamination, and subtle gradations of ground stability. These weren't poetic or artistic expressions, but technical vocabularies essential for communicating life or death information accurately and quickly. The pace of language evolution accelerated because imprecise communication could be fatal. Groups that developed more sophisticated ways of sharing information about environmental conditions had significant survival advantages over those that relied on cruder communication systems. This created intense selective pressure for linguistic innovation, leading to the rapid development of specialized vocabularies and communication techniques. But language served purposes beyond mere information transfer. In a world stripped of almost everything that made life pleasant, the human need for meaning and connection found expression through the development of survival songs and stories that served multiple functions simultaneously. These narratives preserved crucial survival information while providing psychological comfort and group bonding. They were mnemonic devices, entertainment, historical records, and emotional support systems, all compressed into brief, memorable formats that could be shared around the small fires that groups managed to maintain during the brief periods when combustible materials were available. The stories that emerged from this period weren't heroic tales in any traditional sense. They were grimly practical accounts of successful survival strategies, cautionary tales about fatal mistakes, and detailed descriptions of environmental conditions that could help future survivors navigate similar challenges. These narratives served as a form of cultural DNA, preserving hard-won survival knowledge that could mean the difference between group extinction and group survival. The most extraordinary aspect of survival during this volcanic apocalypse wasn't just physical endurance. It was the complete rewiring of human instinct and behavior. Everything your ancestors had learned about staying alive over millions of years of evolution suddenly became not just useless, but potentially fatal. The instinct to seek shelter in caves could kill you when those caves filled with volcanic gases. The drive to stay near water sources became a death trap when those sources turned toxic overnight. Even the basic mammalian instinct to sleep during the cooler night hours had to be abandoned because that's when the deadliest gas concentrations settled into valleys and low-lying areas. Groups that survived longest were those who learned to override their most fundamental biological programming. They stayed awake when every fiber of their being screamed for rest. They kept moving when their bodies demanded they conserve energy. They abandoned comfortable shelters when logic suggested those shelters would become death traps within hours. This wasn't just about being tough or determined. It was about developing entirely new categories of environmental awareness that had never existed before in human experience. The successful survivors became living seismographs, able to feel changes in volcanic activity through their feet and bones before any visible signs appeared. They learned to read the behavior of the few remaining insects and small animals as early warning systems for toxic gas releases or impending eruptions. When the scattered lizards and beetles suddenly disappeared from an area, experienced survivors knew they had minutes, not hours, to evacuate before deadly conditions developed. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed a kind of collective intelligence that went far beyond normal group cooperation. Individual knowledge became group knowledge through constant communication and observation. When one person discovered a new water source or identified a previously unknown danger, that information spread through the group instantly and was integrated into everyone's decision-making process immediately. There was no time for skepticism or debate. Information that might mean survival was accepted and acted upon without question. This collective awareness extended to emotional and psychological states as well. Group members learned to monitor each other for signs of heat exhaustion, toxic exposure, or psychological breakdown. With the same intensity, they monitored the volcanic landscape. They could recognize the subtle changes in behavior that indicated someone was approaching their physical or mental limits before that person was aware of it themselves. This wasn't compassion in any modern sense, but practical necessity. One person's collapse could endanger everyone's survival. The decision-making processes that evolved during this period had to balance speed with accuracy under conditions where both delay and error could be fatal. Groups developed rapid consensus techniques that could evaluate complex environmental information and reach survival decisions in minutes. These weren't democratic processes where everyone's opinion carried equal weight, but meritocratic systems where the person with the most relevant expertise made critical decisions while others provided supporting information and immediate implementation. When the expert on volcanic patterns detected signs of an impending major eruption, the group moved immediately without discussion or debate. When the water specialist identified contamination in a crucial source, alternative plans went into effect instantly. When the weather reader predicted a brief window of favorable conditions for long-distance travel, everyone was packed and moving within the hour. Hesitation wasn't just inefficiency, it was a form of group suicide. The few tools and technologies that developed during this period represented the pinnacle of efficiency and multifunctionality. Every item had to serve multiple purposes because carrying unnecessary weight could slow movement enough to mean death when conditions changed rapidly. A single tool might function as a weapon, a digging implement, a food processor, and a shelter component depending on immediate needs. Materials were chosen not just for durability, but for their ability to withstand the corrosive effects of constant exposure to volcanic emissions. The most prized possessions were information storage systems. Groups developed sophisticated methods for preserving and transmitting crucial survival knowledge using materials that could survive the harsh environment. Patterns carved into volcanic rock served as maps showing safe routes and resource locations. Knotted cords made from processed plant fibers carried detailed information about seasonal patterns in volcanic activity and weather conditions. These weren't primitive record-keeping systems, but highly sophisticated information technologies adapted to extreme environmental conditions. Water purification became a science of its own, with techniques that would impress modern chemists. Survivors learned to use volcanic minerals as filtering agents, creating multi-stage purification systems that could remove toxic compounds while preserving essential minerals. They discovered that certain combinations of volcanic rocks and organic materials could neutralize specific types of contamination that would otherwise be fatal. They even learned to use controlled exposure to geothermal heat to sterilize water without boiling away too much of their precious supply. The most ingenious water conservation techniques involved understanding and manipulating the microclimate effects created by volcanic activity. Survivors learned to create condensation traps using temperature differentials between heated volcanic rocks and cooler air masses. They discovered ways to harvest atmospheric moisture from the brief periods when volcanic activity created localized weather patterns that concentrated humidity in specific areas. Food procurement during this period required completely abandoning normal concepts of nutrition and palatability. Survival meant consuming anything that provided calories and essential nutrients without causing immediate death from toxicity. Groups learned to process volcanic minerals that contained trace nutrients unavailable from biological sources. They developed fermentation techniques that could make barely edible plant matter slightly more digestible, while reducing its salt and mineral content to tolerable levels. The few protein sources available came from insects and small animals, that had adapted to the extreme conditions. These creatures weren't just food, they were indicators of environmental conditions. The presence of certain salt-tolerant insects indicated areas where water might be found underground. The behavior of small reptiles could predict changes in ground temperature that preceded seismic activity. Successful hunters learned to read these animals not just as prey, but as living environmental monitoring systems. Hunting techniques had to account for prey that was far more alert and environmentally aware than anything that existed in normal conditions. These animals had survived the same apocalyptic conditions that killed most of their species. They were the products of the most intense natural selection pressure imaginable, and they had developed sensory abilities and survival instincts that made them incredibly difficult to catch. Successful hunters learned to think several steps ahead, predicting not just where animals would go to find resources, but how they would react to changes in environmental conditions that hadn't even occurred yet. The social bonds that formed between survivors were unlike any human relationships before or since. They were forged in shared mortality and sustained by mutual dependence so complete that individual survival was literally impossible. These weren't friendships or family relationships in any traditional sense, but connections based on the recognition that each person's continued existence depended absolutely on everyone else's knowledge, skills, and vigilance. Trust became both more precious and more fragile than in normal human societies. The person who shared their water with you today might be the same person whose quick thinking saved you from a gas cloud yesterday, and whose knowledge of safe routes would keep you alive tomorrow. But that same person might also make a mistake or a selfish decision that could kill everyone in the group. The emotional bonds that developed had to be strong enough to maintain cooperation under extreme stress, but flexible enough to allow for immediate adaptation when circumstances changed. Conflict within groups had to be resolved instantly and permanently, because extended disputes were luxuries no one could afford. Groups developed techniques for rapid conflict resolution that focused on immediate practical solutions rather than long-term relationship repair. When disagreements arose over resource allocation or route selection, they were settled through quick demonstrations of expertise or immediate tests of proposed solutions. The person who was right in practical terms won the argument regardless of social status or personal relationships. The psychological adaptations required for survival in this environment pushed human mental resilience to its absolute limits. Survivors had to maintain hope and determination while acknowledging that death was not just possible, but probable at any moment. They had to form emotional attachments to other people while preparing mentally for the likelihood that those people would die suddenly and violently. They had to make long-term plans while accepting that those plans might become irrelevant within hours due to changing environmental conditions. Mental health in any modern sense became impossible to maintain. Anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress were constant companions for anyone who lived through this period. But survivors learned to function effectively despite these psychological burdens. They developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to process trauma quickly and continue making rational survival decisions, even while dealing with overwhelming emotional stress. The few moments of respite that occurred during this period became intensely precious and were used with remarkable efficiency. When groups found temporary safety in a stable location with adequate resources, they used those brief periods not for rest and relaxation, but for intensive preparation for the next phase of survival. They repaired equipment, processed and stored food, shared information about environmental conditions, and made strategic plans for future movement. Even sleep, when possible, became a strategic activity rather than simple rest. Groups developed watch systems that maintained security while allowing individual members to recover their physical and mental strength. They learned to sleep in conditions that would seem impossible to modern humans, remaining alert enough to respond instantly to danger while still getting the minimum rest necessary for survival. The dreams and mental imagery that occurred during these brief sleep periods often focused on survival scenarios and environmental dangers. The unconscious mind continued processing survival information even during rest, integrating new knowledge about volcanic patterns, weather conditions, and resource locations. Some survivors reported that solutions to complex survival problems came to them in dreams, as their sleeping minds worked through environmental data and strategic challenges that their conscious thoughts couldn't resolve. Navigation through this hellscape required developing new categories of spatial awareness and environmental reading that went far beyond anything needed in normal conditions. Traditional landmarks didn't exist in a world where the landscape changed daily due to volcanic activity and ash deposits. Instead, survivors learned to navigate using the patterns of volcanic activity itself, understanding how different types of eruptions affected local geography, and using those changes as reference points for movement and location. The most skilled navigators could predict how the landscape would change over time based on current volcanic activity patterns. They understood which areas would become impassable due to lava flows, which regions would be buried under ash deposits, and which locations might become temporarily safer as volcanic activity shifted to different areas. This predictive navigation was essential for long-term survival because it allowed groups to plan routes that would remain viable for days or weeks rather than just hours. Direction finding required completely new techniques, since traditional methods using sun position were impossible in the perpetual haze of volcanic ash. Survivors learned to use magnetic properties of certain volcanic rocks as compass references. They developed techniques for estimating direction based on wind patterns and gas flow directions from distant volcanic sources. They even learned to use the subtle variations in ash composition to determine which direction they were relative to different volcanic activity centers. Distance estimation became crucial for survival planning, but traditional visual cues were useless in the limited visibility conditions. Survivors developed techniques for estimating distances based on sound propagation through the ash-laden atmosphere, understanding how the acoustic properties of volcanic environments affected the apparent location of distant sounds. They learned to judge distances by the intensity and characteristics of ground vibrations from seismic activity. The most sophisticated navigation techniques involved understanding and predicting the movement patterns of the few other survivor groups in the region. These groups weren't necessarily allies or enemies, but their presence indicated the location of resources and safe zones. Learning to track and predict the movements of other survivors became a crucial skill for finding areas that might be suitable for temporary habitation. Time measurement took on new importance when survival depended on precise timing of movements and activities. Traditional day-night cycles were obscured by the constant ash clouds, making normal timekeeping impossible. Survivors learned to use the rhythms of volcanic activity as temporal reference points, understanding the daily and longer-term patterns of eruption intensity and seismic activity that could serve as natural chronometers. The most accurate timekeepers learned to use their own biological rhythms in combination with environmental cues to maintain precise awareness of temporal patterns. They could estimate the passage of hours based on changes in their own hydration levels, energy states, and psychological condition. This internal timekeeping became essential for coordinating group activities and planning movements that required precise timing to avoid predictable environmental dangers. Seasonal patterns, while dramatically altered by the volcanic activity, still existed and had to be understood for long-term survival planning. The few survivors who lived long enough to experience multiple seasonal cycles learned to recognize the subtle ways that volcanic activity patterns changed with seasonal weather variations. These long-term environmental rhythms became the foundation for strategic planning that extended beyond immediate day-to-day survival needs. The concept of home or permanent settlement became meaningless during this period. Survival required constant mobility and the ability to abandon any location instantly when conditions changed. Groups developed portable living systems that could be assembled and disassembled rapidly while providing maximum protection and functionality. These weren't camps in any traditional sense, but temporary survival installations that could be operational within minutes of arrival at a new location. The most successful mobile living systems integrated shelter, water procurement, food processing, and security functions into compact, lightweight packages that could be carried by small groups over long distances. These systems had to function effectively in multiple types of terrain and environmental conditions while requiring minimal setup time and providing maximum protection from the various threats present in the volcanic landscape. Storage and transportation of essential supplies required innovations that balanced weight limitations against the need to maintain adequate reserves for emergency situations. Survivors learned to cache supplies along regular travel routes, creating networks of hidden resource deposits that could support survival over extended periods. These cache networks required sophisticated planning and memory systems to maintain and locate stored resources months or even seasons after they were initially hidden. The psychological concept of territory had to be completely reconceptualized when no location could be defended or occupied permanently. Instead of territorial ownership, survivors developed concepts of temporal access and environmental stewardship that focused on sustainable use of resources during brief occupation periods. They learned to leave resource areas in conditions that would allow them to be used again by themselves or other survivors in the future. The most haunting aspect of this period wasn't the physical destruction, but how it rewired the fundamental human relationship with time itself. In normal environments, humans think in terms of days, seasons, and years. During the Messinian crisis, survival was measured in heartbeats and breaths. The time between recognizing a toxic gas cloud and losing consciousness was measured in seconds. The window between detecting ground tremors and a major earthquake might be less than a minute. Every decision had to be made with the understanding that the next moment might be your last. This compression of time created a psychological intensity that would be impossible for modern humans to comprehend. Imagine living for months where every single breath required conscious evaluation of air quality, where every step had to be tested for ground stability, where every sound might indicate immediate mortal danger. The mental exhaustion of maintaining this level of vigilance was as deadly as any physical threat. Groups that survived longest learned to rotate vigilance duties, allowing individual members brief periods of reduced alertness while others maintained watch. But the most remarkable adaptation was how survivors learned to make complex strategic decisions instantly while under extreme stress. When volcanic activity suddenly shifted and a previously safe route became impassable, groups had to evaluate alternative paths, assess resource requirements, and coordinate movement within minutes. These weren't simple decisions about which direction to walk, but complex calculations involving weather patterns, volcanic activity predictions, resource availability, and the physical condition of every group member. The successful decision makers developed an almost supernatural ability to process vast amounts of environmental information simultaneously and extract the crucial details that meant survival. They could evaluate the color and texture of distant ash clouds while monitoring ground vibrations and assessing the behavior of local wildlife to create an integrated picture of environmental conditions that extended far beyond their immediate sensory range. Sleep, when it occurred at all, became a form of environmental monitoring rather than true rest. Survivors learned to maintain partial awareness even during their deepest sleep periods, remaining alert to changes in ground vibration patterns, shifts in air quality, or alterations in the constant background sounds of volcanic activity. The few who managed to achieve deeper sleep often reported dreams that were indistinguishable from waking survival scenarios, their unconscious minds continuing to process environmental threats and survival strategies. the concept of privacy disappeared entirely during this period. Individual survival was impossible, making every personal need a group concern. Illness, injury, or even temporary weakness in one person affected everyone's chances of survival. Groups developed systems for monitoring each member's physical and mental condition with the same intensity they monitored environmental conditions. Early detection of problems allowed for immediate intervention that could prevent individual issues from becoming group disasters. Medical care during this period bore no resemblance to anything that could be called healing in normal circumstances. Survivors learned to treat injuries and illnesses using whatever materials the volcanic landscape provided. Certain types of volcanic ash had antiseptic properties that could prevent infection in wounds. Some mineral deposits could be processed into crude but effective pain relievers. Geothermal heat could be used for therapeutic warming of injured limbs or for sterilizing crude surgical instruments. But the most crucial medical knowledge involved recognizing and treating the various forms of toxic exposure that were constant threats in this environment. Survivors learned to identify the early symptoms of heavy metal poisoning from contaminated water sources. They developed techniques for treating respiratory damage from volcanic glass particles. They learned which plant materials could help the body process and eliminate the various toxins that were impossible to avoid in daily survival activities. The few pregnancies that occurred during this period presented challenges that would test the limits of human reproductive capability. Pregnant women had to maintain the same level of physical activity and environmental vigilance as other group members while dealing with the additional stresses of pregnancy in a toxic environment. The developing fetuses were exposed to levels of environmental contamination that should have been incompatible with normal development. Yet some children were born during this period, and those who survived their first few months developed remarkable adaptations to the extreme environment. These infants could process air with higher concentrations of volcanic particles than would be tolerable for adults. Their kidneys developed extraordinary efficiency at filtering toxic compounds while conserving essential minerals. Their nervous systems adapted to function normally, despite chronic exposure to environmental stresses that would cause permanent damage in children born under normal conditions. The education of these volcanic-born children represented a complete departure from any previous form of human development. They learned to crawl on surfaces that would burn normal skin. Their first words were often names for different types of volcanic dangers, rather than typical baby vocabulary. They learned to identify toxic plants by taste before they could walk steadily. Their play activities were survival training exercises that would challenge experienced adults. These children developed sensory capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. They could detect changes in air pressure that preceded seismic activity hours before any instruments could measure them. They could identify water contamination by smell at concentrations far below what adult survivors could detect. Their hearing became so acute they could distinguish between different types of underground volcanic activity based on subtle variations in ground-transmitted sound. But perhaps most remarkably, these children seemed to develop an intuitive understanding of volcanic landscape patterns that allowed them to predict environmental changes with uncanny accuracy. They could sense when familiar areas were about to become dangerous, and when seemingly hostile regions might offer temporary safety. This wasn't learned behavior in any traditional sense, but something closer to evolved environmental awareness that had never existed in human populations before. The social structures that governed interactions between different survivor groups evolved into complex systems that balanced cooperation against competition for scarce resources. Groups that encountered each other had to make instant decisions about whether interaction would be beneficial or dangerous. These encounters could result in valuable information exchange, resource sharing, or violent conflict depending on the specific circumstances and the desperation levels of the groups involved. Successful intergroup negotiations required sophisticated communication skills that could convey complex information about resources, dangers, and intentions without revealing strategic weaknesses. groups developed diplomatic protocols that could establish temporary truces, coordinate resource sharing, and exchange crucial survival information while maintaining the flexibility to disengage rapidly if circumstances changed. The most valuable commodity in these interactions wasn't material resources, but information. Knowledge about distant environmental conditions, the location of resource deposits, or successful survival techniques was often more valuable than food or water because it could prevent fatal mistakes or reveal opportunities that would otherwise remain hidden. Groups that became skilled at gathering and evaluating information from multiple sources gained significant advantages in long-term survival planning. Trade between groups, when it occurred, operated on principles completely different from normal economic exchange. Traditional concepts of value became meaningless when the primary currency was immediate survival capability. A piece of information about volcanic activity patterns might be traded for temporary access to a water source. Knowledge about safe travel routes could be exchanged for specialized tools or materials that couldn't be obtained elsewhere. The most sophisticated trading arrangements involved complex multi-party agreements that balanced immediate needs against longer-term strategic considerations. Groups might agree to share information about environmental conditions while maintaining separate territories for resource exploitation. They might coordinate movements to avoid conflicts over scarce resources, while sharing intelligence about common threats that affected everyone's survival. Conflict resolution between groups required techniques that could de-escalate potentially violent situations quickly, while preserving the possibility of future cooperation. Extended warfare was a luxury that no group could afford when survival required constant attention to environmental threats. Disputes had to be resolved through rapid negotiation, temporary territorial agreements, or brief decisive confrontations that left all parties capable of continued survival. The few instances of intergroup violence that occurred were typically swift and brutal, focusing on immediate tactical objectives rather than longer-term strategic goals. Groups couldn't afford to maintain ongoing hostilities because the resources required for extended conflict would compromise everyone's ability to survive the environmental challenges. Even successful aggressors had to consider whether the resources gained through violence would compensate for the energy expended and the potential for future retaliation. Leadership within and between groups became increasingly fluid as survival conditions changed rapidly. The person who was most qualified to make decisions about volcanic hazards might be completely unsuited for negotiations with other groups or for managing internal resource allocation. Effective leadership required the ability to recognize when circumstances demanded different types of expertise and to transfer authority quickly to whoever was best qualified for current conditions. The most successful leaders developed the ability to integrate information from multiple sources and make strategic decisions that balance short-term survival needs against longer-term group sustainability. They learned to evaluate the trustworthiness of information from other groups while maintaining the flexibility to change plans instantly when new information or changing conditions made previous strategies obsolete. Communication systems evolved to handle the complex information requirements of multi-group survival networks. Groups developed standardized signaling methods that could convey detailed information about environmental conditions, resource availability, and group intentions across distances of several miles. These weren't simple danger warnings, but sophisticated information transfer systems that could coordinate activities between multiple groups without requiring face-to-face meetings that might be dangerous or impossible under current conditions. The most advanced communication networks allowed for the rapid dissemination of crucial survival information across entire regions. When one group discovered a new water source or identified a previously unknown environmental danger, that information could be transmitted to dozens of other groups within days through relay systems that use both human messengers and environmental signaling techniques. These communication networks also served as early warning systems for large-scale environmental changes that affected survival conditions across wide areas. When major volcanic eruptions or significant climate shifts occurred, the information could be transmitted rapidly enough to allow distant groups to adjust their survival strategies before the effects reached their locations. The psychological impact of maintaining these communication networks provided benefits beyond mere information exchange. Knowing that other human groups were surviving in the same impossible conditions provided crucial mental health support for people who might otherwise despair at the apparent hopelessness of their situation. The knowledge that human society, however altered, continued to exist, gave survivors emotional strength that was as important as physical resources for maintaining the will to continue struggling against overwhelming odds. Cultural development during this period focused entirely on preserving and transmitting survival-critical information through systems that could function reliably under extreme environmental conditions. Traditional forms of art, music, and storytelling were adapted to serve as memory aids for crucial survival knowledge, while providing the psychological benefits of cultural expression and group bonding. Songs became mnemonic devices for remembering complex information about seasonal patterns in volcanic activity, the locations of reliable resource deposits, and the proper procedures for treating various forms of toxic exposure. These weren't entertainment in any modern sense, but sophisticated information storage systems that could preserve crucial knowledge through oral transmission across generations of survivors. Stories served similar functions, encoding detailed survival instructions within narrative frameworks that made complex information easier to remember and transmit accurately. These tales contained precise descriptions of environmental conditions, detailed accounts of successful survival strategies, and warnings about fatal mistakes that previous survivors had made. They were technical manuals disguised as entertainment, designed to preserve hard-won survival knowledge in forms that could be remembered and retransmitted without written records. The visual arts that developed during this period served primarily as information storage and communication systems rather than aesthetic expression. Patterns carved into volcanic rock served as maps showing safe routes, resource locations, and seasonal timing for various survival activities. Symbolic systems were developed that could convey complex information about environmental conditions using minimal materials and space. These artistic information systems had to be designed for long-term durability under extreme environmental conditions, while remaining accessible to survivors who might not have been present when they were created. The most successful systems used multiple redundant encoding methods that could preserve crucial information even if parts of the system were damaged or destroyed by volcanic activity. Religious and spiritual practices that emerged during this period reflected the immediate realities of survival in an apocalyptic landscape rather than abstract theological concepts. Rituals focused on practical activities like group coordination, environmental awareness, and psychological preparation for the constant possibility of death. Prayer became a form of meditation that enhanced environmental sensitivity and group cohesion rather than communication with supernatural entities. The concept of divine intervention took on immediate practical significance when survival often depended on factors beyond human control or prediction. Survivors developed spiritual practices that helped them maintain hope and determination while acknowledging their complete dependence on environmental conditions that could change without warning. These weren't passive religious observances, but active spiritual disciplines that enhanced survival capability while providing psychological support for people living under impossible stress. Burial practices had to be adapted to conditions where traditional interment was often impossible and where the remains of the dead could pose health hazards to the living. Groups developed rapid disposal techniques that honored the deceased while protecting survivors from disease and avoiding activities that might attract dangerous scavengers or reveal group locations to potential threats. The psychological processing of death became a crucial survival skill when group members died frequently and often under traumatic circumstances. Survivors learned to grieve quickly and efficiently while maintaining the emotional stability necessary for continued survival decision-making. Extended mourning was a luxury that could compromise group survival by reducing vigilance and decision-making capability. Memorial practices focused on preserving and transmitting the survival knowledge that deceased group members had acquired, rather than commemorating their personal characteristics or relationships. When an expert on water purification died, their knowledge became a sacred trust that had to be preserved and passed on to other group members. When someone who understood volcanic activity patterns was killed, their expertise became a memorial that lived on through the enhanced survival capability of the remaining group members. The legacy of those who died during this period wasn't measured in traditional terms of accomplishment or social contribution, but in the survival knowledge and techniques they had developed and transmitted to others. The greatest honor that could be accorded to the dead was the continued use of their innovations and insights by survivors who were still fighting for their lives in the volcanic wasteland. The calendar systems that survivors developed during this period represented some of the most sophisticated timekeeping innovations in human history, born from the absolute necessity of predicting environmental patterns that could mean the difference between life and death. Traditional seasonal markers had been obliterated by the volcanic activity, making it impossible to rely on familiar agricultural or astronomical cycles for temporal reference. Instead, survivors learned to read time through the rhythms of destruction itself. The most skilled timekeepers could predict volcanic activity cycles with remarkable accuracy, understanding that certain types of eruptions followed predictable patterns over periods of weeks or months. They learned that seismic activity intensified according to lunar cycles, even when the moon itself was often invisible through the ash clouds. Ground temperatures fluctuated in ways that corresponded to deeper geological processes, creating thermal calendars that could be read through careful observation of surface conditions. These volcanic calendars weren't abstract intellectual exercises, but immediate practical tools that determined when groups could travel safely, when water sources might become available, and when environmental conditions would shift enough to require immediate evacuation from seemingly secure locations. The ability to predict these patterns even a few days in advance could provide crucial advantages in resource planning and route selection. The most remarkable aspect of this temporal awareness was how it integrated multiple environmental factors into unified predictive models. Survivors learned that changes in ash cloud density often preceded shifts in seismic activity by specific time intervals. Variations in the chemical composition of volcanic gases could indicate changes in deep magma chamber activity that would affect surface conditions weeks later. Even the behavior of the few remaining plants and animals provided temporal cues about environmental changes that hadn't yet become apparent through direct observation. Weather prediction during this period required completely reimagining how atmospheric systems functioned in a world dominated by volcanic emissions. Traditional weather patterns had been disrupted by the constant injection of ash and gases into the atmosphere, creating localized climate systems that bore no resemblance to normal meteorological conditions. Survivors learned to read these altered atmospheric patterns as carefully as they monitored volcanic activity. The few rainfall events that occurred were often triggered by specific combinations of volcanic activity and atmospheric conditions that could be predicted with careful observation. Survivors who learned to anticipate these rare weather could position events themselves to collect precious fresh water while avoiding the dangerous conditions that often preceded and followed volcanic storms. Wind patterns became crucial navigation tools when visibility was limited to a few dozen yards in most directions. The movement of ash clouds followed predictable patterns based on the interaction between volcanic emissions and local topography. Experienced survivors could determine their location and plan their routes by understanding how these wind patterns would carry volcanic materials across the landscape. Temperature prediction required understanding the complex interactions between geothermal heat sources, volcanic activity, and atmospheric conditions. Surface temperatures could vary dramatically over short distances and time periods based on underground thermal activity that wasn't immediately visible. Survivors learned to identify the subtle surface indicators that revealed the presence of dangerous heat sources or potentially useful warm zones that could provide temporary relief from the constant environmental stress. The development of early warning systems during this period represented remarkable innovations in environmental monitoring, using only natural observation techniques. Groups established networks of observation posts that could detect and communicate changes in environmental conditions across distances of many miles. These systems use combinations of smoke signals, reflected light, and sound signals that could function reliably despite the challenging atmospheric conditions. The most sophisticated warning networks could detect major volcanic eruptions hours before their effects reached distant locations, providing crucial time for evacuation or protective measures. They could identify changes in wind patterns that would affect the movement of toxic gas clouds, allowing groups to adjust their positions before dangerous conditions developed. They could even predict the arrival of the rare weather systems that might provide brief opportunities for water collection or easier travel conditions. These communication systems required maintenance and coordination that tested the limits of intergroup cooperation during periods of extreme resource scarcity. Groups had to balance the immediate costs of maintaining warning networks against the long-term survival benefits they provided. The systems that functioned most effectively were those that provided immediate practical benefits to all participants, while building the trust and coordination necessary for longer-term collaborative survival efforts. The information that flowed through these networks wasn't limited to immediate danger warnings, but included detailed environmental intelligence that helped all connected groups improve their survival strategies. Knowledge about successful water purification techniques, effective shelter, and reliable construction methods. Food sources share WASD rapidly across entire regions when communication systems functioned properly. Personal hygiene during this period became a critical survival skill, rather than a matter of comfort or social acceptability. The constant exposure to corrosive volcanic ash and toxic gases created skin conditions that could become life-threatening if not managed properly. Survivors learned to use available materials to protect their skin and remove dangerous accumulations of volcanic particles that could cause chemical burns or respiratory problems. Water was far too precious to use for washing, forcing survivors to develop alternative cleaning methods using dry materials that could absorb or scrape away dangerous contaminants. Certain types of volcanic sand had abrasive properties that could remove built-up ash and salt deposits without requiring water. Some plant materials, when available, could be used to create cleaning compounds that neutralized acidic residues from volcanic emissions. The few clothing items that survivors possessed had to serve multiple functions while withstanding constant exposure to corrosive environmental conditions. Garments were designed for maximum protection rather than comfort, using materials that could resist chemical damage while providing insulation against extreme temperatures. Clothing maintenance became a constant activity, with daily repairs necessary to maintain the protective functions that meant the difference between survival and exposure-related death. Footwear represented one of the most critical survival technologies, as the ground surface in most areas was either burning hot, chemically corrosive, or sharp enough to cause serious injuries. Survivors learned to construct protective foot coverings using combinations of volcanic rock, processed plant materials, and any available fabric or leather. These weren't shoes in any traditional sense, but protective devices that had to be rebuilt frequently as they were destroyed by the harsh terrain. The psychological adaptation to constant physical discomfort became as important as any practical survival skill. Survivors learned to function effectively despite chronic pain from chemical burns, respiratory irritation, and the constant stress of exposure to extreme environmental conditions. Mental techniques for managing pain and discomfort were shared within groups and became part of the essential knowledge base that determined individual and group survival capability. Sleep systems during this period had to balance the need for rest against the constant environmental dangers that made extended unconsciousness potentially fatal. Survivors developed techniques for achieving restorative rest while maintaining sufficient awareness to respond instantly to changing conditions. These weren't normal sleep patterns, but carefully managed periods of reduced consciousness that allowed for physical recovery without compromising survival vigilance. The few dreams that occurred during these brief rest periods, often on environmental conditions, focus, and survival scenarios, as the unconscious mind continued processing the constant stream of survival-critical information that dominated waking consciousness. Some survivors reported that solutions to complex survival problems came to them during these altered sleep states, suggesting that the mental adaptations required for survival extended into unconscious cognitive processes. Group sleep arrangements required coordination and planning that balanced individual rest needs against collective security requirements. Watch rotations had to ensure that someone remained alert to monitor environmental conditions while allowing other group members to achieve the minimum rest necessary for continued functioning. These systems required high levels of trust and coordination, as the safety of sleeping group members depended entirely on the vigilance and competence of those maintaining watch. The transition periods between sleep and waking became critical times when survival groups were most vulnerable to environmental dangers or attacks from desperate competitors. Groups developed procedures for rapid mobilization that could get everyone alert and ready for immediate action within seconds of detecting threats. These weren't military drills, but practical survival techniques that could mean the difference between group survival and group extinction when conditions changed suddenly during rest periods. Nutrition during this period bore no resemblance to normal dietary concepts, as survival required consuming whatever materials could provide essential nutrients and calories without causing immediate death from toxicity. The few food sources that remained edible often required extensive processing to reduce dangerous mineral concentrations to barely tolerable levels. Survivors learned to evaluate potential food sources based on their nutritional content relative to their toxicity, making calculated decisions about acceptable risk levels for different types of sustenance. Caloric requirements increased dramatically due to the constant physical stress of survival activities and the energy demands of maintaining body functions in extreme environmental conditions. At the same time, available food sources provided fewer calories per unit than normal foods, creating a constant energy deficit that had to be managed through careful activity planning and resource allocation. Mineral balance became a crucial concern when the few available foods often contained dangerous concentrations of volcanic minerals that could cause poisoning if consumed in normal quantities. Survivors learned to process foods to extract essential nutrients while removing or neutralizing toxic compounds. These weren't cooking techniques in any traditional sense, but chemical processing methods that could make barely edible materials marginally safer for consumption. The few protein sources available came primarily from insects and small animals that had adapted to survive in the toxic environment. These creatures often contained high concentrations of environmental toxins that had bioaccumulated in their tissues, making them dangerous food sources that required careful preparation and limited consumption. Survivors learned to identify which species were safest to eat and how to process them to minimize toxic exposure while preserving their nutritional value. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies became constant health concerns when normal dietary sources of essential nutrients were unavailable. Survivors learned to identify and process alternative sources of crucial vitamins and minerals, often using volcanic materials or the few remaining plants that could concentrate specific nutrients in their tissues. These weren't supplements in any modern sense, but crude nutrient sources that could prevent the most dangerous deficiency diseases. Food storage and preservation required techniques that could maintain nutritional value while preventing spoilage in extreme environmental conditions. Traditional preservation methods were often impossible due to lack of salt, fuel for smoking, or suitable containers. Survivors learned to use volcanic heat and mineral deposits for preservation processes that could extend the usability of scarce food resources without requiring materials that weren't available. the psychological aspects of nutrition became as important as the physical requirements, as the constant consumption of barely palatable and potentially dangerous foods created mental stress that could affect decision-making capability and group morale. Survivors learned to maintain focus on the practical necessity of nutrition while managing the emotional and psychological challenges of surviving on foods that would be considered inedible under normal circumstances. Sharing food within survival groups required careful calculation of individual needs against group resources, with decisions that could determine who lived and who died based on available caloric reserves. These weren't emotional or moral decisions, but practical calculations about optimal resource allocation that would maximize group survival probability. The most successful groups developed systems for food distribution that balanced individual survival needs against collective group sustainability. Hunting and foraging during this period required completely different strategies than anything used in normal environments, as the few remaining animals and edible plants had developed extreme survival adaptations that made them difficult to locate and capture. Traditional hunting techniques were useless against prey that had survived the same apocalyptic conditions that killed most of their species. These animals possessed sensory abilities and survival instincts that had been honed by months or years of exposure to constant environmental dangers. The most successful hunters learned to think like their prey, understanding that these following animals were normal behavioral patterns, but had developed entirely new survival strategies adapted to volcanic tracking became conditions. Less about following physical signs, and more about understanding the logic of survival in an impossible environment. Where would an animal go to find the specific combination of safety, water, and food that it needed to survive? How would it balance the risk of exposure against the need for essential resources? Foraging required extensive knowledge of how volcanic conditions had affected plant life and which species might still be edible after exposure to extreme environmental contamination. Many plants that appeared healthy were actually toxic due to mineral uptake from contaminated soil and water sources. Survivors learned to identify subtle indicators that revealed whether plants were safe for consumption or had become dangerous due to environmental changes. The few edible plants that remained often required extensive processing to remove accumulated toxins while preserving their nutritional value. These processing techniques were developed through dangerous trial and error, as mistakes in plant preparation could result in severe poisoning or death. The knowledge gained through these experiments became precious survival information that was carefully preserved and transmitted within and between groups. Seasonal variations in food availability, while dramatically altered by volcanic conditions, still existed and had to be understood for long-term survival planning. Survivors learned to recognize the subtle environmental cues that indicated when certain food sources might become temporarily available, and how to position themselves to take advantage of these brief opportunities. The integration of hunting and foraging activities with other survival requirements demanded sophisticated planning and coordination. Food procurement activities had to be balanced against the need for environmental monitoring, shelter maintenance, water procurement, and security. Groups developed systems for allocating time and personnel to different survival activities, while maintaining the flexibility to respond instantly to changing environmental conditions that might require immediate evacuation or defensive action. Tool construction during this period required reimagining the fundamental principles of technology when traditional materials were either unavailable or actively dangerous to handle. Wood, the foundation of most prehistoric toolmaking, was virtually non-existent, except for the occasional charred remnant that crumbled at the touch. Metal ores were present in abundance due to volcanic activity, but the extreme temperatures made traditional metalworking impossible without sophisticated heat management techniques that had to be developed from scratch. The most successful toolmakers learned to exploit the volcanic environment itself as a manufacturing resource. Obsidian-like volcanic glass could be knapped into cutting edges sharper than anything available in normal environments. But the material was often contaminated with toxic compounds that made handling dangerous without proper protection. Survivors developed techniques for working these materials, using intermediary tools that protected their hands while allowing precise shaping of the volcanic glass. Hardened salt deposits became unexpected sources of tool materials, as certain types of salt formations could be carved into functional implements that were surprisingly durable under the right conditions. These salt tools had to be protected from moisture and required constant maintenance, but they could serve essential functions when other materials were unavailable. The knowledge of which salt formations were suitable for tool making and how to work them effectively became specialized expertise that was highly valued within survivor groups. Volcanic pumice provided abrasive materials that could be used for sharpening tools and processing other materials. But working with pumice required understanding its variable density and chemical composition. Different types of volcanic activity produced pumice with different properties, and survivors learned to identify and select the most suitable materials for specific applications. The finest pumice could be used for detailed work like tool finishing or food processing, while coarser grades served structural functions. The few organic materials that survived the environmental catastrophe had to serve multiple tool functions simultaneously. Processed plant fibers became binding materials, cutting tools, and protective coverings depending on how they were prepared and applied. Animal sinews and hide scraps, when available, were too precious to use for single-purpose applications and had to be integrated into multifunctional tool systems that maximized their utility. Tool maintenance became as important as tool creation, as the corrosive environment would destroy even the best-made implements within days if they weren't properly cared for. Survivors developed protective coatings using available materials that could shield tools from the worst environmental effects while preserving their functionality. These weren't sophisticated chemical processes, but practical techniques using volcanic minerals and organic residues that could extend tool life significantly. The psychological relationship with tools changed dramatically when each implement represented hours or days of dangerous work to create and could mean the difference between survival and death if lost or broken. Tools became extensions of the user's body and mind, requiring intimate knowledge of their capabilities and limitations. The loss of a crucial tool could compromise an entire group's survival prospects, making tool security and redundancy essential elements of survival planning. Specialized tools had to be developed for the unique challenges of volcanic survival that had never existed in normal environments. Devices for testing ground stability, instruments for measuring air quality, and tools for processing toxic materials safely became as essential as traditional hunting and food preparation implements. These innovations required understanding both the immediate practical requirements and the underlying principles of how materials behaved under extreme environmental conditions. The most sophisticated tool systems integrated multiple functions into single implements that could adapt to different survival situations without requiring extensive tool inventories that would be impossible to maintain or transport. A single tool might serve as a weapon, a digging implement, a food processor, and a construction component depending on immediate needs. This multifunctionality required design principles that balanced versatility against effectiveness for specific applications. Tool sharing within groups required protocols that balanced individual needs against collective tool availability. Unlike normal environments where personal tools might be owned exclusively by individuals, survival conditions made tool hoarding counterproductive and potentially dangerous for group survival. Groups developed systems for tool allocation and sharing that maximized their utility while maintaining individual accountability for tool care and maintenance. The integration of tool use with other survival activities required sophisticated coordination and planning. Tool maintenance had to be scheduled around other essential activities like environmental monitoring and resource procurement. Tool creation projects had to be balanced against immediate survival needs, as the time and resources required for toolmaking could compromise other critical activities if not managed carefully. Knowledge preservation during this period became a matter of life and death, when crucial survival information could be lost forever if not properly transmitted and maintained. Traditional methods of knowledge storage and transmission were inadequate for the complex technical information required for survival in volcanic conditions. Survivors developed sophisticated memory techniques that could preserve detailed technical knowledge without requiring written records that would be impossible to maintain under environmental conditions. The most critical knowledge involved understanding the subtle environmental indicators that could predict changes in volcanic activity, weather patterns, and resource availability. This information was too complex and detailed to rely on casual observation or informal transmission between group members. Instead, survivors developed systematic approaches to environmental monitoring that could detect pattern changes and predict future conditions with remarkable accuracy. Specialist knowledge holders within groups became living libraries of survival information, with individual experts responsible for maintaining and transmitting detailed knowledge about specific survival domains. The volcanic activity specialist might know hundreds of specific indicators for different types of eruptions and their likely effects on local conditions. The water expert could identify dozens of different types of contamination and the appropriate treatment methods for each situation. These knowledge specialists weren't just repositories of information, but active researchers who continued developing and refining survival techniques based on ongoing experience and observation. They conducted careful experiments with new materials and methods, while documenting the results in ways that could be preserved and transmitted to other groups. This experimental approach was essential for developing improved survival techniques that could increase group survival probability over time. The transmission of specialist knowledge required training programs that could transfer complex technical information quickly and accurately to other group members. These weren't formal educational processes, but intensive practical training that could prepare individuals to function as backup specialists. If the primary expert was killed or incapacitated, the knowledge had to be transmitted in ways that would remain accurate even when passed through multiple individuals over extended time periods. Information verification became crucial when survival decisions were based on technical knowledge that couldn't be easily tested or confirmed under immediate survival conditions. Groups developed techniques for cross-checking information from multiple sources and testing the reliability of different knowledge transmission methods. False or inaccurate information could be as deadly as lack of information when survival depended on making correct decisions about complex environmental conditions. The integration of knowledge from multiple specialists required coordination systems that could combine different types of expertise into unified survival strategies. The geological specialists' predictions about volcanic activity had to be coordinated with the weather experts' understanding of atmospheric conditions and the resource specialists' knowledge of water and food availability. These integrated assessments formed the basis for strategic decision-making that could determine group survival outcomes. Knowledge sharing between groups became a form of diplomatic and economic exchange that could provide mutual benefits while maintaining competitive advantages. Groups had to balance the immediate benefits of sharing survival information against the potential risks of revealing strategic capabilities or resource locations to potential competitors. The most successful knowledge exchange arrangements created mutual dependencies that encouraged ongoing cooperation while providing immediate practical benefits to all participants. The psychological burden of maintaining critical survival knowledge created unique stresses for specialist knowledge holders who understood that group survival depended on their memory and decision-making capability. These individuals had to maintain detailed technical knowledge while functioning under the same extreme physical and emotional stresses that affected all group members. The pressure of responsibility for other people's lives added psychological dimensions to survival that went beyond individual self-preservation. Cultural innovation during this period focused on developing new forms of artistic and expressive activity that could serve practical survival functions while providing psychological benefits essential for maintaining group morale and individual mental health. Traditional art forms were impossible to maintain when materials and time for purely aesthetic activities were unavailable. But survivors discovered that creative expression could be integrated into practical activities in ways that served both functional and psychological needs. Decorative elements were incorporated into tool design and construction in ways that provided psychological benefits without compromising practical functionality. Tools that served multiple survival functions could also serve as sources of aesthetic pleasure and cultural identity, helping maintain psychological well-being during periods of extreme stress. The patterns and designs used in tool decoration often contained coded information about the tool's construction or proper use, integrating practical and aesthetic functions seamlessly. Music and rhythm were adapted to serve communication and coordination functions within and between groups. Complex information could be encoded in musical patterns that were easier to remember and transmit than spoken instructions. Rhythmic patterns could coordinate group activities like construction work or resource processing, while providing psychological benefits that improved group cohesion and individual morale. Storytelling evolved into sophisticated information storage and transmission systems that could preserve detailed technical knowledge within narrative frameworks that were engaging and memorable. These stories weren't entertainment in any traditional sense, but technical manuals disguised as compelling narratives that could transmit crucial survival information across generations, while providing psychological benefits that helped maintain hope and group identity. Visual art forms were developed using available materials that could serve as information storage systems, while providing aesthetic experiences that supported psychological well-being. Patterns carved into volcanic rock or arranged using available materials could serve as maps, calendars, or technical diagrams, while also functioning as artistic expressions that helped maintain cultural identity and individual creativity under extreme conditions. The integration of cultural activities with practical survival requirements demanded sophisticated time and resource management that balanced immediate survival needs against longer-term psychological and social requirements. Groups that successfully maintained cultural activities alongside essential survival functions demonstrated higher levels of group cohesion and individual resilience than those that focused exclusively on immediate practical needs. Ceremonial activities were adapted to serve practical coordination functions while providing psychological and social benefits essential for group survival. Rituals could serve as training exercises for emergency procedures, coordination mechanisms for complex group activities, or information transmission systems that reinforced crucial survival knowledge while strengthening group bonds and individual commitment to collective survival. The few celebrations that occurred during this period focused on practical achievements that directly contributed to group survival rather than abstract cultural or religious concepts. Successful completion of major construction projects, discovery of new resource sources, or survival through particularly dangerous environmental conditions became occasions for group recognition and psychological reinforcement that supported continued survival efforts. Personal expression within the constraints of survival conditions required finding ways to maintain individual identity and creativity while conforming to the rigid requirements of group survival. Individuals learned to express personality and creativity through their contributions to group survival activities, finding personal satisfaction and identity through their specialized roles in collective survival efforts. The development of aesthetic standards during this period was based entirely on practical functionality rather than traditional concepts of beauty or artistic merit. The most beautiful tools were those that functioned most effectively under extreme conditions. The most admired decorative elements were those that served practical functions while providing psychological benefits. Aesthetic appreciation became inseparable from survival utility in ways that would be unrecognizable in normal cultural contexts. Innovation in practical survival techniques often emerged from creative approaches to technical problems that combined functional necessity with individual creativity and cultural expression. The most effective survival innovations were often those that integrated multiple practical requirements with psychological and social needs in ways that serve both individual and group survival while maintaining cultural identity and creative expression under impossible conditions. The relationship between individual creativity and group survival created new forms of cultural development that balanced personal expression against collective needs in ways that served both individual psychological requirements and group survival objectives. These cultural innovations represented remarkable human adaptability that could maintain essential aspects of human creativity and cultural expression, even under conditions that seemed to eliminate all possibilities for anything beyond immediate physical survival. The reproductive challenges faced by survivors during this volcanic apocalypse pushed the boundaries of what human biology could endure. Pregnancy became a calculated risk that could either ensure group survival through the next generation or doom both mother and child to agonizing death in an environment that showed no mercy to the vulnerable. Women who conceived during this period faced decisions that would be unthinkable in normal circumstances, weighing the slim chances of successful childbirth against the certain knowledge that pregnancy would compromise their own survival capabilities when every member's contribution was essential for group survival. The physiological demands of maintaining a pregnancy while constantly exposed to toxic volcanic gases, extreme temperatures, and chronic malnutrition created medical challenges that no human population had ever faced. Developing fetuses were exposed to levels of environmental contamination that should have been incompatible with normal development. Yet some pregnancies continued to term, producing children whose very existence represented evolutionary adaptations, occurring in real time under the most extreme selective pressures imaginable. Birth itself became a community crisis that required the entire group's resources and attention at precisely the moments when environmental vigilance was most crucial. Labor could not be postponed for safer conditions or better circumstances. When contractions began, the group faced immediate decisions about resource allocation, security, and risk management that could determine not just the survival of mother and child, but the continued existence of everyone who depended on group cohesion for their daily survival. The few children who survived birth faced immediate challenges that would test the limits of human adaptability. Their first breaths contained volcanic particles and toxic gases that would be lethal to modern infants. Their earliest nutrition came from mothers whose bodies were struggling to maintain basic functions under extreme environmental stress. These newborns had to develop survival capabilities within days of birth or face certain death from exposure to conditions that challenged experienced adult survivors. Yet those infants who did survive developed remarkable adaptations that seemed to border on the miraculous. Their respiratory systems adapted to process air with particulate concentrations that would cause permanent lung damage in normal children. Their digestive systems learned to extract nutrition from the barely edible materials that constituted the only available food sources. Their nervous systems developed heightened sensitivity to environmental dangers that allowed them to detect threats before they became immediately lethal. The education of these volcanic-born children represented a complete departure from any previous form of human development. Their first lessons involved distinguishing between different types of ground instability by touch and sound. They learned to identify toxic gas concentrations by smell before they could speak in complete sentences. Their play activities were survival training exercises that would challenge experienced adult survivors, yet they approached these deadly serious activities with the curiosity and enthusiasm that children brought to games in normal environments. These children developed sensory capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to adults who had lived through normal childhoods. They could detect subtle changes in ground vibrations that preceded major seismic activity by hours or days. They possessed an intuitive understanding of volcanic landscape patterns that allowed them to predict environmental changes with uncanny accuracy. Their hearing became so acute that they could distinguish between different types of underground geological activity based on variations in sound frequency that were imperceptible to normal human hearing. The Messinian crisis eventually ended, as all geological catastrophes do, but not before it had fundamentally transformed every species that survived it. The Mediterranean Sea eventually refilled when the Gibraltar Strait reopened, bringing blessed relief to a landscape that had been transformed into something resembling an alien planet. Yet the legacy of those who endured this volcanic hell lived on in ways that would shape the future of life on Earth. The extreme adaptations, the behavioral innovations, the social cooperation forged in the crucible of impossible conditions became the foundation for more resilient, more adaptable forms of life. Every time you take a breath of clean air, drink fresh water, or sleep safely in your bed, remember those ancient survivors who faced down an epoch, elliptic Earth, and refused to surrender. Their story isn't just about survival, it's about the extraordinary power of life itself to adapt, endure, and ultimately triumph over even the most hostile conditions our planet could create.